unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. Today, we kick off the 8th season of Grand Tamasha with a very special guest. My guest on the show today is Ambassador Shyam Saran, one of India's most decorated Indian diplomats of his generation. After a career spanning 34 years in the Indian Foreign Service, he was appointed India's Foreign Secretary in 2004 and held that position until his retirement from service in September 2006. He is currently a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research in Delhi and author of a brand new book, How China Sees India and the World. This new volume is a companion to his highly acclaimed 2018 book, How India Sees the World. I am pleased to welcome him to the show for the very first time. Ambassador, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Milan.
So I'd like to begin this conversation by turning back the clock a little bit and asking you about your own personal evolution when it comes to China. You note in the outset of the book, soon after you joined the Foreign Service in 1970, you learned you were going to be sent to Hong Kong to learn Mandarin. Yes. In your own words, you weren't particularly enthused, but this began a sort of lifelong endeavor to try and understand this massive and critically important country. Tell us a little bit about the impact that first assignment had on you and the way that you came to understand China.
Thank you, Milan. I think, as I have explained in the introduction to the book, going to Hong Kong to learn Mandarin as a student really opened up a completely new world for me, a very unfamiliar world, a very strange world at that time. And, the language was like a kind of opening the door to an absolutely fascinating civilization, a brilliant culture, and very different from our own culture, very different from what I had been used to. So it was a kind of a journey of discovery, learning the language and getting to meet people from China, learning to appreciate Chinese cuisine. Also, learning about Chinese aesthetics. I have explained also in the book, as you might have seen, that while there are affinities between India and China, culturally speaking, there are also rather important differences. For example, I point out that Chinese language does not have an alphabet. The language is through ideograms. Chinese written language goes back almost 3,500 years ago, while in India, the script came much later. It was the language which was spoken, it was remembered, it had to be pronounced in just the right kind of way. Very different from the Chinese, language. So it was like having to learn a completely different cultural idiom in order to understand China. So yes, it was a period which really made me very, very interested, very curious about this culture. And that curiosity, in a sense, has still remained with me all these years.
You had this line in your introduction which jumped out at me, and I'd like to ask you to reflect on it. You write at one point that India is a retreating image in China's rearview mirror. And I think the reason this line stood out to me is because on the face of it, it contradicts what a lot of normal Indians seem to believe, which is that China is sort of obsessed with keeping India under her thumb. How do you square these two sorts of beliefs?
This is because of the growing asymmetry of power between the two countries. When you go back to, say, 1990, even though China had already begun its economic reform and liberalization program, India had just started, in fact, on its own journey in terms of economic reforms. The fact is that our trajectories have been since then very different. And so if we started off more or less at the same level, today The Chinese GDP is about 5 times that of India. And in many other metrics of power, there is no doubt that China is ahead of India. So while India is much more preoccupied with the China challenge, perhaps it would be fair to say that even though China does look at India as an important and a major power, it does not consider India to be in the same league as China. So I'm not surprised that India is more preoccupied with China than China is with India. And that is what is reflected in that observation.
But there's something else very interesting going on. You were motivated to write this book, as you say, because you felt there was a severe gap in India's understanding of this important neighbor. And you note that this lack of understanding can't just be remedied at the elite level, but this sense of understanding has to percolate downwards through society. Why is it so important for ordinary Indians who aren't members of the Indian Foreign Service or members of the government to have a better understanding of everyday China?
If you take, for example, the political class in India, which includes the political leadership, its understanding about China is very, very limited. It's very thin. Also, as far as the educated public in India is concerned, again, there are stereotyped images of China, just as China has stereotyped images of India, which also I have referred to in the book. So on both sides, there has not been much effort made to try and really understand each other in the larger context of their histories, of their cultures, and it is very much more limited to the immediate sort of train of events or recent history. This leads to, I think, perhaps policies which are not quite well informed and well rooted in the reality of India-China relations. There ought to be much greater familiarity with a country which is already very important for us and is going to be even more important going into the future.
I want to get to the roots of this Indian ignorance about China, because when you recount the centuries of evolution in Chinese history, you note, and I want to quote here, there is almost no sign of China having registered in the Indian consciousness throughout its long history, end quote. India's recognition of China is sort of more of a modern phenomenon. I think many people will read this line and sort of, shake their head and say, how can this be? How can it be that China didn't register in the Indian consciousness for the longest time?
So I think you have to recognize that, today India and China may be contiguous neighbors, but that was not the case through most of history. We were separated by vast, land spaces, by the whole Tibetan plateau, the Himalayan mountains. We were separated by large ocean space. So the possibilities of engagement and contact were somewhat limited because of this very geographical reality. Secondly, as I have pointed out, that while, say, something like the Buddhist influence which spread in China, the difference was that it was not just limited to, say, Chinese scholars or Chinese Buddhist monks who were interested in India and who made frequent visits to India to try and understand this country, to see, the wellspring of Buddhism in a sense. But on the Indian side, there was no such engagement. Buddhism spread amongst the people of China to the extent that even now most Chinese know that Buddhism came to China from India. But there is nothing comparable the other way around. There is nothing Chinese which really impacted the ordinary Indian through this history. Yes, there were Indian monks who went to propagate Buddhism in China. They did a lot of translation work in China. There were large number of merchants from India who went, not only did trade with China, but even went and settled in Chinese coastal cities. Perhaps there were also some Chinese who did the same on the Malabar or the Coromandel coast. That engagement continued, but it was then limited to a very small, section of people. So it did not really make an impact, larger impact on India. So there is that asymmetry. That perhaps there was a greater impact of India on China through history rather than the other way around.
One of the core arguments you make in the book is that a central part of China's character can only be understood through the prism of a sort of uniquely Chinese notion of hierarchy. And you summarize that concept by writing the following: for there to be harmony in society and peace in the realm, it was necessary for each constituent to know his place and relate to others according to a strict code of behavior, end quote. Tell us a little bit about the origins of this order and sort of what it means for the structure of Chinese government, right? Because on the face of it, this seems rather incompatible with our common notions of liberal democracy.
Well, if you see what I have said about Chinese history, you have this notion of a civilized and very highly cultured center, which was basically the Yellow River valleys, the Yangtze River Valley, which was really the heartland of China. And this being under constant pressure and constant assault by the essentially aggressive and sometimes violent tribes along the Chinese land periphery, both in the north as well as in the west, whether they were Mongolians or later the Manchus or you have the Tibetans, constantly, putting a huge amount of pressure on China. And as I have pointed out, for nearly 50% of Chinese history, China itself fell under alien rule, under the rule of non-Han ethnic groups. So there was always a sense of, something like a siege that, you have this very highly civilized and very productive center. But, as you went away from this center, there were concentric circles of less and less cultured, less and less civilized, countries and peoples. So there was, from that came this sense of hierarchy. That, we are an advanced culture and civilization, but, around us are people who are what later became barbarians, and therefore that sense of hierarchy came in, by the way, which also reflected something which was a social norm in Confucian society. Because this is what Confucius said, that if you want harmony, then it is very important to observe certain codes of conduct, regulating relations in the family, for example, the head of the family and the rest of the family, in the community itself, and between the ruler and the people whom the ruler ruled. Each one of them should be conscious of their duties and responsibilities. And as long as that hierarchical principle is observed and respected, there will be harmony. Harmony in society, but that then extended outwards is also harmony as far as the basic geopolitical space is concerned. So this sense of hierarchy is very, very important as far as China is concerned. So while they were perhaps not as powerful as they are today, they may have talked about multipolarity as something that they would like to see. But now that they are a very major power, the second most powerful country in the world, they have reverted to that principle of hierarchy. That, say, the Asian order should be one which is dominated by China as the most powerful country in the region. And say the American presence in the region is illegitimate in some kind of sense. And also trying to put across the narrative that China being at the top of the pile today is nothing but going back to where it always was through history. That there was a century of humiliation, but that was an aberration. essentially, China has always dominated the Asian space. And therefore, it is due the deference as a preeminent power.
But what I found interesting in characterizing China's worldview is that, in a sense, what I picked up from your narrative is that there are very good reasons for China to be skeptical of the outside world, right? At one point you write, quote, that Chinese suspicion and mistrust of the outside world is not a contrived narrative, end quote. Is this principally a result of the so-called century of humiliation? Is this the lasting impact that this has had on the sort of Chinese psyche?
Well, that is certainly one of the important components. But as I pointed out, this also reflects a longer history of China, or at least what was considered to be the heartland of China, always being, sort of threatened by these less civilized, less cultured tribes on its land periphery. So the sense of siege is not only because of the century of humiliation, but I would say that the century of humiliation, in a sense, further exacerbated that sense of siege. That the outside world is a hostile place, and China needs to be able to deal with this hostile space through military strength, through diplomacy, which has always been the case. But this is something which is not really only because of the century of humiliation. At least that's my perspective.
Hey, Grand Tamasha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grand Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. I mean, you reference a conversation that the then Chinese Vice Premier Wang Qishan and U.S. Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson had back in 2008, which Wang sort of, tells Paulson, "You were my teacher, but now I'm in my teacher's domain, and look at your system. We aren't sure we should be learning from you anymore." And so, in your narrative, the 2007-2008 global financial crisis, in which obviously the U.S. had a principal role to play, was a turning point in terms of China's broader. How did it change or shape sort of China's worldview? If you had to break this up into kind of pre-2008, post-2008.
One, with respect to the relationship between China and the U.S., and you can broaden it to China and the West. That this particular crisis, in fact, exposed the limitations of the capitalist system, the vulnerabilities of the capitalist system, that China's sort of model of, allowing some capitalist activities, but, the one-party state maintaining a degree of control and discipline, that was something which really what was the model for the future. Also, don't forget that it is from 2007-2008 that two things happen, as I point out in the book. One is that the asymmetry of power between China and the US starts, shrinking. Obviously, because China goes back to a 6%, 6.5% rate of growth after the break that was caused by the crisis. But neither the US nor Western Europe are able to actually get back to any kind of a decent growth rate. There is some sort of stagnation as far as the Western economies are concerned. So the gap keeps on increasing between China and the US. And from the Indian perspective, what was different before 2007-2008, which was that even though India was behind, but India was seen as catching up with China. India was seen as shrinking the gap between China and India. Now, after 2007-2008, actually the gap between India and China started expanding rather than diminishing. So these two things, parallel things which were happening, changed China's perception regarding the relative power equation, between China and the other major powers. And that explains a great deal of what we see unfolding since then.
But if you step back from China's considerations and think about the future, one of the things you note towards the conclusion of the book is that we are not in a China-centric world today, and you seem to suggest that we are likely not to be in one anytime soon. And I think, this goes against the conventional wisdom in some quarters, which says, it's inevitable. We're all going to be speaking Mandarin one day. What gives you confidence in this assessment?
Yeah. So my belief is that, US perhaps has reacted a bit too late to the emergence of China as a peer power. But I also believe that China has declared victory too early, that it is still not at a stage where it can actually have any sort of realistic possibility of graduating and, in fact, inheriting the kind of mantle which the United States has had. Their model is the United States. They want to be where the United States has been since the Second World War, as the most dominating power in the world. This is what they would like China to be. And they think that they have currently actually a very good opportunity to be able to do that. Now, this is where I think their calculations may have been wrong, because with respect to Asia itself, because unless China dominates Asia, it is difficult to see how China can dominate the rest of the world. Now, as far as Asia is concerned, whatever may be the historical situation of China being the preeminent power and essentially no competitors in its periphery, that is not the case today. I mean, you have very substantial powers in Asia today, even if you forget about the US as being a very important presence. If you take, say, Japan, if you take Korea, if you take India itself, you take Indonesia, Australia. I mean, Asia is today a very crowded geopolitical space and with fairly substantial powers. So my sense is that any attempt by China to try and dominate this space will inevitably invite, a countervailing response. And you see that countervailing response already crystallizing in the region. If we are talking about, say, the Quad itself, it is very much a countervailing mechanism. So this is the reason why I doubt whether China would be able to actually graduate to a position where the US has been. That is not a realistic possibility.
So we have a more multipolar world, we have a more multipolar Asia, but the question remains, and you address this in your book, is how India can best meet the China challenge, right? And one of the things that you say quite forcefully is that India can succeed, only if it can build on its relatively stable polity and the inherent cultural assets that the country possesses. In your writings elsewhere, in your op-eds, your essays and articles, you've been quite critical about India's domestic turn in recent years. So I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit further on, how exactly are the domestic, political, and social trends in India at odds with the path that you'd like to see the country pursue if it is to meet the China challenge successfully?
So one, I think there is, not only in India, but in many other democracies of the world, there is a kind, what I call a dictator envy, that, it is, democracies are, very amorphous, they don't have much coherence, and therefore they are not able to really marshal all their energies together to be able to deal with the challenges that we are facing today. And therefore, the Chinese have been to some extent successfully been able to show that, the model that we have, which is essentially an authoritarian model, but with, reliance on market mechanisms as well, this is really the model for the future. This is the most successful way of dealing with the kind of challenges that we are facing. Now, this is where in India too, you have that perception amongst some people. that perhaps we should learn from what what the Chinese have been able to achieve through some dose of authoritarianism. I have argued that India, unlike China, whether you like it or not, is a very, very diverse and plural society. Its strength lies in plurality. You cannot, put a kind of a monochromatic frame over this plurality. If you try to do that, this will exacerbate social tensions, exacerbate political tensions. And this is what, the Constitution tries to put across, that you will emerge as a flourishing democracy, not by suppressing plurality, not by suppressing diversity, but trying to transcend it through a concept of citizenship, equal citizenship, enjoying certain fundamental rights on a completely equal basis without any reference to caste, creed, or religion. And that has been, to my mind, that has been the great strength of India. If you look at political transitions in India so far, they have been very different to the political transitions in China, which have often been very, very violent. We have not had that, despite many sort of predictions which were made in the early years that, India cannot afford to have democracy, that, once Nehru goes, after Nehru who, or after Indira Gandhi who. But actually, India has had very smooth political transitions throughout its independent existence. So those are, to me, those are the assets that we have. And rather than leverage those assets, if we try to, see some other model, see that we should become more like China, then I think the problems will begin. Because we are, again, the book tries to put across that we are two very different countries. Our trajectories through history have been different. And we have to take that into account in terms of dealing with whatever challenges that we are facing. And on the economic side, we have ourselves demonstrated that democracy that India has is not incompatible with, accelerated economic growth. I mean, that's more a management problem, our inability to really, govern better. But that is not something which is related to, the lack of an authoritarian kind of dispensation in India. So this, I believe very strongly that, as I keep saying, that India needs to be more India rather than India being more like China in terms of, how it sort of deals with the challenges that it is facing.
So it's interesting, in some sense, the political elites in India are looking at China and perhaps internalizing the wrong lessons. But you do say at the end of the book that, despite the fact that you have two very different systems, two very different cultures, two very different peoples, there are certain lessons that India can derive from the many centuries of Chinese history that you analyze. So thinking about perhaps on the positive side, as you reflect on the sweep of Chinese history and its political evolution, what are the things that you think India should perhaps take away, but not necessarily as models, but as guidance for how they think about their own country and society?
I have pointed out that one of the important lessons that perhaps we can draw from China is the fact that during the period of its accelerated growth, it accepted somewhat modestly and somewhat with a degree of humility that it needed to learn from others. So there was a period where I have described China as a kind of a giant sponge, which was absorbing knowledge and technology from wherever it could get it. Maybe even beg, borrow, or steal in a sense. Recognize that, say, human resource is a very key component of any kind of a growth strategy, and went about it very systematically. Now, it also utilize a favorable geopolitical moment because of, say, the American interest in China as a kind of a countervailing power to the then Soviet Union, which was regarded as the major threat. It utilized that geopolitical moment also to be able to create a much more favorable international economic environment for itself. So those are things that certainly we can we can learn from. That with respect to our economic growth trajectory, what is it that we can do to be able to absorb, advanced knowledge, advanced technology from our partners? And today you have a favorable geopolitical moment in the sense that today the West, whether it is the United States or Western Europe or Japan, they all have a stake in India's economic success. Maybe it is for a narrow geopolitical reason, but they do have a stake in India's success. Why not leverage that in terms of much more favorable conditions for flows of capital and technology into India, in terms of your access to knowledge from these centers? They are still centers of knowledge, advanced knowledge. Also, if you take even the geopolitical aspect, if you go to most Southeast Asian countries, they want a higher imprint of India in the region, both economic as well as security. Now, that's also a very favorable thing, that there are countries who actually want you to have an expanded presence. So these are all advantages that you have, which you need to be able to, fashion a foreign policy, fashion a security policy, and an economic strategy, which is able to leverage these advantages. So from that point of view, what China was able to do during its period of very, very rapid growth, utilizing geopolitical advantages, knowing what to focus on, I think those are also very important lessons to learn.
So, Ambassador, let me just conclude this conversation by asking you about the current situation on the border. We are still in the middle of a rather tense situation where we have thousands of troops amassed on both sides of the border, a seemingly endless round of consultations and talks between the two sides. When you were in the Foreign Service, you participated in many of these tense moments and discussions with your Chinese counterparts. Given the strain that this border issue has created due to recent events, is it possible for India and China to have a quote unquote normal bilateral relationship? There are many people who say that you can't just simply compartmentalize this security dilemma because it has existential stakes for India, both in terms of its own sovereignty as well as a whole host of other issues that matter to ordinary Indians. So how do you see sort of where we go from the present moment forward?
So the good news is that despite these tensions, both sides have seen an advantage in continuing their engagement. So even though the progress on the kind of tensions we are facing at the border, these have not really diminished in any significant way. But the fact that the two sides continue to believe that dialogue process should be carried forward, I think that's a positive sign. I think the Indian side also has been, I think, somewhat prudent in continuing that engagement, because it also gives you a certain window into understanding, what the drivers of Chinese behavior are. Secondly, I think it is also important to take into account the fact that before this recent series of incidents, essentially the two sides were agreed in a sense, without really putting down a paper, that even though we have differences between us on various issues, there are also areas where we have convergent interests. So I have mentioned the fact that as, say, chief negotiator on climate change, there were many issues on which we actually were able to work together. Similar was the case, for example, in the trade negotiations. So there are areas where India and China in the past have been able to work together. And there is no reason why they should be precluded from the future. But I think it is correct on the part of the Indian side to say precisely what you mentioned, that we cannot completely compartmentalize what is happening on the borders from the rest of the relationship. The Chinese position is, okay, we have a problem at the border, but, it should be not allowed to affect other aspects of our relations. That is a rather simplistic way of, trying to handle relations. And I think by now, it is fairly clear to China that something has to be done with respect to the border issue if India-China relations have to get back to the kind of engagement that we had in the past. There is also, don't forget, the situation is complicated because of the further polarization in the international affairs. This has been exacerbated by the Ukraine war and the fact that Russia and China are, in a sense, virtual allies today. So that too influences perceptions on the Indian side as it affects perceptions in other countries. So essentially what India is trying to do is to find a kind of a balance between what may be called, domestic balancing and external balancing. That is, what are the ways in which we can ramp up our own capabilities, both economic capabilities as well as our military capabilities. That is fundamental. But in the meantime, what are the ways in which we can order our relationships with other major powers, which gives us some degree of capability to constrain Chinese aggressive behavior? So Chinese, of course, may try to convey to you that your closer relationship with the United States of America is somehow provocative, is somehow hostile to China. My own view is, and my own experience has been, that the stronger the relationship that India has with the US and other partner countries, that does help India to manage the China challenge much better than if we were more isolated.
My guest on the show this week is Ambassador Shyam Saran. He's currently a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research and author of a new book published by Juggernaut Press, How China Sees India and the World. In some ways, this new volume is a sequel to his 2018 book, How India Sees the World. Ambassador, thank you so much for these books and for sharing your time with us. It's a fascinating conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com, India's fastest growing podcasting platform. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we reference on this week's episode, visit our website, grandtamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Caroline Duckworth, Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Cliff Jayapranada is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.